Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Lindsey Byrd in Writing is Hard. Today's interview is on writing a suspense novel and also dealing with dual timelines. We go over characterization, using a major and well known city as a setting, and also how an author's personal emotional connection and experience can help inform how characters are formed. I hope you enjoy. Today's author interview is with Victor Suthammanont, a New York-based lawyer who received a BFA in drama at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts before transitioning into law. He has performed in various plays and stand-up comedy, and his debut novel, Hollow Spaces, is a thriller suspense following the adult children of acquitted murderer John Lowe. Its back of book blurb reads, 30 years ago, John Lowe, the only Asian American partner at a prestigious New York City law firm, was acquitted of the murder of an employee he was having an affair with. The repercussions of that long ago event still haunt his adult children. Brennan, a lawyer following in her father's footsteps in more ways than one, has always maintained that the trial got it right. Hunter, a disgruntled war correspondent whose similarities to his father run more than skin deep, believes their father got away with murder. Their convictions have pushed them apart. Now, spurned on by their mother's failing health, the estranged siblings decide to reconcile their differences by reinvestigating the murder to come to a definitive conclusion and, in the process, salvage what's left of their fragmented family. Told in a dual timeline that moves between John's perspective 30 years prior and Brennan and Hunter's present-day investigation, Hollow Spaces is a moving portrait of a flawed man's shocking fall from grace and a gripping exploration of race in corporate America, including filial loyalty, ambition, and the fallout of a sensational trial for those caught in its wake. So, as we get started, first off, your book sounds fascinating. What drew you to writing this story in the first place?
There was a couple of different inspirations. One was I had read a story in the New York Times about a man in upstate New York who, small town, had been acquitted of murder. And I think the evidence in that case was somewhat marginal. And in the interview after his acquittal, he said a line that was basically like, the acquittal's great and all, but something to the effect of everybody here thinks I did it, or something to that. And that just hung with me because, when you watch the typical legal drama or courtroom drama, the natural ending point of that is the trial and then the verdict, right? The acquittal or conviction, depending on what story it's telling. And that's where the story ends. And for me, I think it just stuck in my mind about like, what if you start a story there? What is it? What is the burden of an acquittal? When the justice system imposes its a toll on someone, it's a heavy thing. And as a lawyer and someone who worked for the government, tried to be careful about the charging decisions that we made and the recommendations I made to my client, which was a civil law enforcement agency. You were very aware of the cost to the people you were investigating, and definitely the terrible cost if you were wrong. And so I was thinking about that story, and that's how John's story came to be. And then as to the children's story, I was thinking about intergenerational trauma and the things, kids inherit from their parents in terms of emotions and psychology and things like that. And so, and then also sibling relationships and how two siblings might get along and the tensions in those kinds of relationships. And one day the whole thing clicked for me, those two things together. And I was like, wait, that's a story. And so that's how I wrote the book.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think first, when you're looking at the acquittal process, there's a lot of emotions. So you have the emotions of the family of the person who has been acquitted, but also the emotions of whomever the family of whichever the victim was on the other side, where they can feel, no, they got it wrong because they're desperate for closure. They want to know what happened and finding out that it wasn't this person or believing that this person got off. There's a lot of emotions there when you're writing a story dealing with all of those different emotions and perspectives, how do you give justice to all the different sides?
Yeah, and that's a question I really struggled with in the novel, in terms of, it's definitely John's point of view and his family's, but very early on, because again, not spoiling anything that the back cover doesn't spoil, the acquittal happens, and so I really dive into that moment for both, just that moment in the courtroom of the utter horror of that moment, right? Either an innocent man's been accused of murder, or he got away with it, and that's a horrible moment. That is a terrible, terrible moment for the system and for everything that happens. And I think I did spend some time, that's not exactly a story in terms of telling every side of that story. I focused on John's, but I definitely do pay attention to that. And I think one of the struggles as a writer in writing that book is, or a story like this is, again, who is the victim? And that story is told both from John's perspective, in terms of how he thinks about his relationship with the victim, whose name is Jessica, and the children, when they think about, wow, to the extent it's Brennan who believes her father's innocent, you know, Jessica's murderer is still on the loose. And to the extent that it's Hunter who believes his father is guilty, well, my father got away with the murder of this poor woman, and don't I owe something to her and her family? And as a writer telling the story too, it's like I needed her to be more than just a name. And so I use John's story really a lot, and to a lesser extent, the kids looking backwards, to tell her story, and her story is imperfect because it's being told through John's point of view primarily. But I really did want to focus on that story because she was a person. She is a person, and that's important to recognize.
If it's not a spoiler, how old were the kids when the murder trial was happening?
I think they're like 7 and 8 ish in the book. I don't know that I specify, but it's very clear they're young enough to be young and old enough to remember some of the moments.
Yeah, because I feel like it would be different for the reaction you'd have to it when you're a certain age, like when you're a young child versus an adult child of dealing with your parent and your relationship there. When you're writing the trauma, I suppose, of growing up in that particular household with all of this happening, how do you reflect on the actual childhood experience of what that's like?
Yeah, for me, I thought about it in ways that were, I think, pretty personal to me, in terms of what I remembered of my relationship with my parents and my relationship and their relationship with each other. My mother died when I was pretty young, when I was 13 or so, and so putting myself in their shoes and thinking about what I remember of my mother, what I remember about her relationship with my father, what I remember about, and to be clear, my mom wasn't murdered or anything. Um,
That's good to know.
but when I thought about those things and what kids remember, and I thought about my own children, and what their experience of me must be like growing up, I just thought about the way certain memories stick and really form, and some, you just have the vaguest sense of a memory, or having the memory of a memory, and how that forms your character and who you are and the way you relate to things in the present. And so that their story really does focus on that jump between their experience of him as children and versus their memory of him as an adult.
Well, memory, it's so transient. I mean, as a lawyer, I'm sure you know that like you could remember something different at this moment than you will tomorrow because of just your emotions at that moment, what's distracting you, what's not distracting you, how you're feeling. When you're dealing with trauma, especially, there's a lot of retrospective thinking where the memory that you might have had as a child could morph or change or adjust. It might not be a complete lie or manifestation or something wrong, but it might be different from reality. How do you bring that onto the page, either as an unreliable narrator or as a narrator that is reliable, but maybe a little bit doubtful?
Yeah, no, and that's a good question. Because it's told from the third person, close point of view, I didn't have to worry about the unreliableness of the narrator, in the sense of like the way you would in a first person narrative, which is the person writing the story telling me the truth, versus, talking about these gaps in their memories, or their experience of it. Um, but in terms of that question, I think it did provide some interesting ways to explore the characters' emotions, and how they, you know, again, there's a part early in the book where the children have differing flashbacks of the same event, right? In their memory, it's different, right? Very, yeah, I don't know if you've seen Rashomon, but that kind of device. And it's slight. It's the truth of the moment is there for both of them in some ways, but it is also different, and I did kind of do that a little bit, but it is definitely, memory is fallible. Absolutely. And even in John's story, I suppose there's elements to which the reader might question in his flashbacks. Like I said before, in terms of telling Jessica's story, even the victim's story is it's being told through his point of view, so there is an inherent subjectiveness to it.
For a lot of writers, I would say writing one timeline is difficult enough, but you chose to write two timelines that are happening at different moments. Why choose this particular method of telling this story?
I thought to really get the sense of exploring the theme of the mystery itself, right? Like this was not a 1 or 2 year mystery to solve. It took 30 years, and if they solve it, even. And I think that there was definitely a to tell the story about the impact on the children. You could look at them, and like you just mentioned, you can look at the impact on them as children, which would only be part of the story. Because even if I told just the present, that 30-year ago story, and it would end at some point, in fact, they carry that burden with them for a long time. And so I wanted to be able to show that. So those were two things that played into that decision. In terms of writing the dual timelines, that was a nightmare. That was very difficult.
Um,
Um,
Practically, did you write one and then the other? Did you go back and forth? What was your actual process?
I did both at different points. So I think originally I started with interlacing chapters, like I was cutting back and forth. And then that got very, very difficult because I didn't know who did it. I didn't know who had committed the crime. And that's the fun secret of the book is I probably wrote 90% of the novel without knowing the answer to. I literally wrote the entirety of John's story and maybe 80% of the kid's story without knowing who did it. And the but to go back to the timeline, so I started cutting back and forth, and then that got too confusing and unwieldy. So basically, I settled down, and also because as a writer, I'm sure it's you get into a certain mindset or a certain character mindset, and then jumping out of it to go to a different character's mindset was just a lot of transitioning in terms of just the writing process. And so I really just told John's story. I wrote it all, including to the end, and literally wrote that entire one without knowing whether he did it or not. And then started writing the kid's story, or went back to the kid's story and got to the end of that. And then I went back and actually intercut them and lined them up and then made some changes so that it would flow.
Did you find that you liked a particular voice better? Like, were you like, I love John's voice, this is easier, or I love the kid's voice, it's easier for me to write, or were they both pretty similar?
I think because I wasn't writing in the first person, and so I wasn't switching that kind of voice in it. I think if I had written it in first person, I definitely would have undertaken more of an effort to say make the voices in the narration sound very different. As it was, I think I was able to keep more of my own authorial voice in it, but with little tweaks because again, it's close point of view. So there are definitely ways that John thinks about things and goes through his mental process versus the two children in their point of view chapters that were different. But I love them all the same in terms of I think they're great characters. They all spoke to me in ways that made them really fun to write and difficult. It's a very I think there's a lot of stuff on that page.
What was the editing process like? Because when you're juggling timelines, if you make one change in the past, it could have ripple effects in the future. Was that very difficult, or were you pretty much set on making only tiny changes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I had two different ones. One is I tend to edit as I write, which keeps me stuck. So I actually adopted a process for this novel where I'd only let myself look at the last 2 pages I wrote, almost like kind of as a warm up to get into writing new materials. And so I kept a separate document where anytime I changed something that would have to change something earlier, I just made a note of it so that when I finished, I could go back and change it.
That's very smart.
Yeah, because I was like, otherwise I'll just keep going back to change every little thing. So that was one way I dealt with that issue. The other thing is, when I had finished the novel and there were changes from my agent and from my editor, a lot of those, or even ideas I had in terms of my own revisions, a lot of those did necessitate going back and flowing through the stories. Like, so for example, like when I got to the 80% way, when I finally figured out, oh, this person did it, I had to figure out, okay, I'm gonna have to change these 4 things beforehand to, add in a little bit more to make it fair for the reader, because, the reader who's trying to solve the mystery deserves some clues. And so I had to build those in. And so there was a lot of going back, but a lot of making notes. And then you get to know the timeline, I think, of your own book in terms of the way it's working. And so, that was basically it. But there were, luckily for me, even with when it went to the publisher and my editor, Dan Lopez, who's great, we didn't change many structural things or things that had to really radically change huge portions of that book.
You mentioned that you already had an agent. When did you get your agent, and how did that relationship with the development of this book come about?
Sure. So I'd gotten my agent on a novel I'd written before this one, and we did not end up selling that. The first project I sold with her was actually a short story I wrote as a joke at the beginning of COVID, and it had legs, and so we sold it to Audible, which was great and a fun process. And then I was writing this one around the same time. This novel was the one I had finished. I started writing after I finished the last one, and so we weren't necessarily going to boil the ocean in selling the first one, because I had this one in the works and this one seemed great too. And so we went out with this one and ended up selling it.
I think a lot of writers and people who are just starting to get their agents and starting the querying and submission process, they're vaguely aware that it's entirely possible you're not going to sell your first book. But what was that process like so you've just started, you've written a book, you've gotten your agent, and now you're realizing maybe it's time to transition. You mentioned, I think, that you already had the idea for this story. What was the decision factor of saying, okay, time to move on to the next thing?
Sure. There were 2 kind of big factors in that. One is, in trying to sell my debut, my agent and I had discussed the strategy of, her question for me was basically, how badly do you want to be traditionally published? And how badly do you want to have a career? And what's the balance between those 2 things? Because in her mind, and I think it's, she wanted to find the right publisher for the debut, because you get one debut. And that debut can really set the stage for having a career or a second book or whatever, versus not having one sometimes, from a purely business side, publishing business side of things. And so her advice to me was, let's stick to a very small group of publishers and houses and imprints where I think we can get good support as a debut, so that you can actually get a second book deal if that's what you want. If you just want to sell this book, we can sell it, right? Well, find somebody to publish it. It might not be the best deal. It might not be the strongest publisher, but you'll get it out there. And for me, I really tried to take a long-term view and not be impatient. And again, I was older when I got my agent than, I guess I was in my early 40s, or I don't even know, right? So at that point, I was like, well, I've learned patience, hopefully, in the course of my life, now that I'm older. I think if I was 23, or me at 23, at least, speaking for me only, I might have been a lot more impatient. But I realized taking the long view has benefits. And so that was part of that calculation. But it was difficult. I loved that book. I think it's great. I hope to sell it. And I think it's a great story. It's very different from Hollow Spaces, which makes writing interesting for me, because I'm kind of writing very different stories, I think, a lot. But my agent was, supportive of the new idea. So anyway, when we got to the end of the list of people she thought were whatever but I was writing Hollow Spaces. The minute I finished the old book, I started writing Hollow Spaces. And so with that being done, and I actually think that's good advice, because that's the advice, right? When you're out on submission, just write something new, keeps your mind off the submission processes. because I had the other book ready right away, kind of, we were like, okay, well, let's just try to switch this to this next project.
Did you talk to your agent about your idea for Hollow Spaces before you got started, or did you just start writing it?
No, I just started writing it. I think I definitely let her know I was working on it, because I was like, hey, if you don't think this has legs at all or is unsellable just on concept, let me know. I think if she had told me that, though, I think this book, I would have written it anyway. This book is, I think, very close to me. I poured a lot into it, and so I may have written it anyway. I think the ones I'm working on now, I definitely ran some of these ideas past my agent as to, which do you think is the most viable in terms of focusing my energy on it. But again, I think she liked all the ideas I had. So that was, I'm right now, I'm just kind of bouncing between 2 or 3 new projects, seeing which one's the one that's going to grab me.
What was it about this book that made it so important to you?
I think the way I wrote it was, with respect to John, I really thought about things in my life to go through my aging process, right? Between when I was 20 and my 30s, and then when I was in my early 40s. Um, Kind of the change in my own personality, and things I felt I had to fix in terms of deep sadness and anger about certain things. So like, like I mentioned, my mom died when I was very young. My father died at the beginning of COVID, while I was writing the book, and so I thought a lot about grief, right? And I think John's story is at root a man who cannot deal with grief, um, and that flows out in different ways than my personal life, right? In terms of my parents dying and other things. But for him, it really comes from his marriage, in terms of the way that marriage has developed. And so when I thought about somebody who can't deal with grief and what that might lead a person to, I think that resonated with me as a writer and as a person, in terms of like working through those issues in my own mind. And for the children, the same thing. They have the grief of this father who has been accused of murder, and the impact on their lives, and the fact that their relationships have been strained and damaged by that. And I looked at people around me who have tough family situations. I'm lucky to be close to my family, but a lot of people aren't, and I see that, and I know how important my family is to me, and wow, that must be terrible. And so I really put myself in that mindset. Like, so the book really is a lot of, I guess, thought exercise for me of like, what if I made every wrong choice in my life, and ended up in a certain place, but it enabled me to kind of think about things that had just, sat with me a long time. So that's why it's, I think, an incredibly personal book for me.
Grief is such a powerful emotion, and I think it's also an emotion that it's hidden beneath other emotions. It manifests in other ways. And so it's not just sadness where suddenly you're just crying the entire time. Like you said earlier, it also manifests as anger. It can manifest as displays of irresponsibility because you're just trying to, rush through and do something to get a quick serotonin fix so that you don't have to think about the grief. When you're writing characters who are dealing with grief, irrationality is a word that comes to mind, of just making choices or reacting or responding in ways that aren't necessarily purely logical. How do you incorporate that into their characterization where that grief, you can tell as the reader that our grief is that profound?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is where sometimes as a writer, I play games with myself, right? We're told to show, not tell, right? And so there's plenty of, part of me was thinking, and one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever gotten once in a story is, uh, when you're describing something, or a room or an emotion or whatever, right? You obviously have the surface thing, right? That anybody would notice when they walk into a room. The chair is here, right? But what about the 5 or 6 other things nobody would notice but make that thing feel alive, the room feel alive, or an emotion? So when I was writing the book, I think I did focus on, okay, what's the surface level emotion, at least in terms of just telling a story. And then what I really tried to do through either the point of view of the character in terms of their thought process, or even within dialogue, right, is and this is where my acting training actually did come in very handy, right? Is like, what's the subtext? What's the, so I really tried to build in, even if he's angry in a scene, as the writer, I understand, okay, he thinks he's angry, but he's sad, right? And so what does that mean? How does that play out? How do I incorporate that? How do I clue the reader in that there's something deeper going on here? What We all know what it's like to feel angry. We all know what it's like to feel sad. But like, if I'm describing that, how do I get to something that's even deeper that you might not in the moment realize, but later on you're like, oh, it felt just like that. Like that was the thing. It sat here physically. So I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the physical impacts of his emotions, like where it's hitting him in his body, the things he's doing with his body that sometimes, if I was telling it from his person point of view, I might not have described because he wouldn't realize he was doing it. But as the third person, I can say like, oh, he clenched his fist in a way that, whatever, I'm being cliche here with fist clenching, but you know what I mean? So anyway, that's how I worked on that.
It's interesting you're bringing up your acting training because I remember a drama coach when I was an undergrad. It wasn't my coach, but I was talking to a friend and they were describing their process of like reading plays and playwriting and stuff like that. And she said, when you're designing a scene, there's two things to keep in mind. It's the thing and the other thing. The thing is what's physically happening. The other thing is the other thing that's also happening at the same time. And keeping those two in balance, where yes, you might be saying a certain thing, but what are you actually doing? Yes, you might be doing a certain thing, but what are you actually feeling? And just keeping that in mind of like, what are all of the other things happening beyond the main plot? So it's something that I've kept in mind when I'm writing as well. It's just what is my thing and my other thing, which is a very weird sentence to say.
Yeah, but I get it entirely. And in fact, one of the things that's lovely about certain things or in the legal drama, in the legal context, right? Or writing a legal based novel or a police procedural is you can have characters having a very technical conversation, and in this book, for example, the siblings, his children, are talking about the evidence and what they think about it. And so it's a very kind of business-like conversation, but underneath that whole conversation is a very, very personal conversation about each of them and what their emotions are. And so, those scenes were fun as a way to convey information. And again, you can't make every scene in the book like this crazy fraught moment, right? But there are elements in writing those scenes where I was like, how do I convey this information to the reader, let the characters analyze it, but also add that other thing there, and so that's a fun process. I had fun trying to do that in a skillful way.
I'm glad you brought up the legal side of it because I am curious, as somebody who actually has a legal background, you probably know more than most how the actual real life process of these types of situations go. How do you avoid being too jargony or being too, this is exactly what it's like, and no, it doesn't happen overnight, and yes, this is going to, take months and months of discovery and months of this and that, which doesn't really fit into a suspense novel very well. But how do you manage the balance of reality in the legal world and suspense novel?
Yeah, I think that's where the voice in my head, I'm usually pretty good about not worrying about, is this going to sound dumb on the page so much when I'm writing. But with the law stuff, it definitely did occur to me that a lot of people who might read this would be lawyers who would quibble with, certain choices I had to make it dramatic or to make it a story in this way. The way I got around a lot of that, frankly, was the legal portion of it doesn't drive the story as much, so I was able to kind of stay out of the minutia of procedure and process. But the other thing too for me was, as a lawyer, I'm a litigator, so I'm always trying to think about how. And I worked in securities law, securities enforcement, so a lot of my job, frankly, for the last decade has been taking very complex regulations and laws and economic transactions and trying to distill them down to a seventh grade level, right? How do I explain this to a seventh grader? And so in the book, it's much easier to do that because frankly, I could just ignore things that were too complicated, or elide them, or So I think I did a good job in this book because I think most people who read it, lawyers and non-lawyers, nobody complained. So I didn't get the complaints that this is too complex, I don't understand it, and I didn't get the the complaint that this is unrealistic and you're dumb.
I have a very strange question to ask you that I just thought of. When you're writing a novel, because you've written so many legal documents, after you hit period, do you put two spaces? And was that difficult to get out of?
Oh, that is a fun question. So, true story. When I first started my legal career, I was putting two spaces after sentences. And then I became a convert to the fact that we don't need to do that because we don't have typesetters anymore. And so I became a very strong convert of one space after a period. And that was even before I think I joined. No, it was maybe after I joined the government. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Over 10 years ago at this point. And since then, I'm a one space after a period guy. And it would drive me crazy because sometimes you have multiple people working in a document. But the good news for me is it's much easier to take the extra spaces out than to put them in. So I usually won that fight.
I worked as a legal assistant for a little while, and it was a constant battle in that office because I was so used to doing the one space for writing, and they were very much a two space kind of office. And I had a whole stretch of my writing career for a while where I was just like putting two spaces after everything. And I actually had somebody comment like, "Do you work in legal? Because why are you putting two spaces?" And I was so ashamed. I was like, "I live two lives."
I did so much research on that issue before I converted to the one space thing. And I mean, I think most people, at least where I was working, have converted over to one space. But there's still, I think, some two space holdovers. But I would send them articles about like, this makes no sense. Why are you doing two spaces?
Because it's tradition.
I know, but it's yeah, I get it. But it was anyway. I'm a one space person. That made the last 10 years much easier. But I think I may have been using. I have to go back to look at things I was writing 15, 20 years ago to see what I was doing creatively with one or two spaces.
Do you think your editor would have brought it down to one space when it finally went to publishing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, honestly, they would bring it down to one space in a legal brief when you sent it to the printer. They just had the two spaces there to know for whatever typesetting issue they had. They would just do it, but then it would look like it was one space. So that's why I was like, none of this makes sense anymore.
So the setting of your book is in New York City.
Yes.
Um, it's a massive place. But if I remember correctly, you were living in the city. How did you bring elements of the city in, and how is that setting important for the book itself?
Yes. I think I had a lot of fun with using New York in the story. One is I've lived here basically my whole life. I grew up in Jersey City, which is right across the river. I came to New York for college and to NYU, and have been here ever since. And so, one of the things I did with the book was think about the city is, like you said, massive. So, how do I set it in? It doesn't feel like it's tight in terms of setting because you can go to so many different neighborhoods and talk about so many different things. And so I really tried to work that into the story and given the primary driver honestly for me about using the city was the fact that I live here and I know it best. I think the story could have worked in, let's say, Chicago. Um, but I just couldn't have written Chicago, I think, as authentically as I could have written about the neighborhoods here that they find themselves in, because I've stood in them and I've walked through them. And, so there are things there that I think really add to it. I also think there's something about some of the big law in New York City kind of vibe. I mean, there are big lawyers and big law firms in other cities, but I think in terms of telling the story of that industry a little bit and John's experience in it was important to me. And it's, again, I know the law firms in New York City best, not necessarily the ones in Chicago and Los Angeles as well, to pick other big cities. So but again, I got to travel around. There's settings on the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, on Upper Manhattan. There's downtown Manhattan. They go to there's stuff where they end up going out deep into Brooklyn or up to Westchester County. So I got to kind of play around with just bouncing them around a little bit, just to give a variety of the different places here.
New York is so well known to so many people, and especially when you've lived in New York for a while, it almost has its own sense of self and its own character, of just how it appears on the. There's this certain smell to the subway. There's a certain experience you get when you walk through the different boroughs. Um, when you're describing it, how do you tap into that? So you've got your own familiarity, but you're also drawing in people who might not be as familiar with New York into this world, into this character of what the city actually is.
Yeah, well, the benefit of people knowing it so well from film and media and other books is, in some ways, when you need to keep the story moving, you could just assume that when you say the Empire State Building, everybody knows what that looks like, right? Or
Grand
the
Central
way
Station, Times
exactly.
Square, yeah.
Yeah, so you can immediately get a lot of vibe out of just saying a name, right? And for the other places where I assumed people would be less familiar or less well documented, let's say out in Bay Ridge or I don't even, not Bay Ridge, the Rockaways. You know, there I painted a picture, more of a picture of like, here's what the street looks like. Here's what the houses on the street look like. Here's what you can see from where they're standing in terms of front and back. There are other things too, where, to your point, and I think what I was discussing earlier, which is, you know, the idea of this, of let's say a railway apartment building. You know, the way they're laid out when you walk into it. You know, there's two doors. There's like little tiny vestibule, and so I really thought about, okay, it's you want to paint a picture for people to give them a sense of what that's like. The stairs, the fact that these stairs in these buildings are typically like creaky and
Covered
old.
in gum.
Buildings. Exactly. So I tried to think about like, what are the little things that would, you can't describe every little thing. You just grind the story to a halt, right? But you really do want to give a sense of like the vibe of that location, especially when it's helping tell the story and set the scene. Sometimes it's just the subway. They're on the subway and they're going this place, and that's the only reason you have to note it. But sometimes you're right. The story might revolve around like, okay, this is what it feels like to actually sit on a subway train. This is what it smells like. This is the way the air feels down there, because it always feels different from the air on the street.
Especially during the seasons. If it's middle of summer, it's the worst place on earth.
Absolutely. So hot. It's awful.
It's very bad. Something though that I think the reason why I used the word character earlier is because there's an interaction with the city where, depending on your day and also depending on your mood, you could feel a completely different way just because you're where you are. The noise, if you don't want to listen to the noise because you're sensory overload, not the best place in the world to be, because there's no escaping the constant honking of the horns, the constant this and that, the lovely people playing wonderful music right outside your window, or the ice cream truck at 2 a.m.
It is shocking. The one thing that I love to this point, it's both a curse and a blessing in New York, is that I've worked in high-rise buildings and obviously, but to your point, trying to escape, you could be 37 stories up in the air and hear things on the street, which is kind of a very interesting, through like industrial glass windows, right? These are huge structures. That part is very interesting to me, about just always feeling like you're in it. And then to the same token, even if you ran into the basement of a building thinking it's going to be quiet, there's all kinds of the city's built on a ton of subways and tunnels, and you can feel
The
those things.
vibrations, you feel
Exactly.
everything.
So it's very hard to get that sense of isolation. But in terms of the story, this story, Hollow Spaces, what made that interesting for me is, despite that, you can feel very, and maybe because of it, if you feel lonely, if you feel isolated, you can feel really that way, right? Really just disconnected from people, because you're so used to, one, having to build at least a mental bubble around yourself, because otherwise everybody's in your space all the time sometimes. But also like that idea of, and this is probably more of a 20-year-old thought for me than currently, but when you're trying to find connections with people, you're trying to find a community, to be surrounded by so many people and feel like you can't find that is very hard. And so that to me was part of that story. And that's why, in terms of the setting and how that setting helps tells a story for John, particularly, what is it like to be this person in the sea of faces and both be notable and not. It was interesting to kind of go down that well too.
You brought up the title a second ago, and I wanted to circle back to it. Why did you choose Hollow Spaces, and what does it really mean to you?
Oh man, that is the titling of this book was very, very difficult. I man, I struggle with that. A lot of the other things I write, I think titles, they either come to, I don't know what your experience is, but like titles come to you or they don't, right? And this was one where it did not. And I had lists of things and kind of ran them through friends, and it was very difficult. What I came down to is the idea of it works on a couple of different levels. There's a device in the story that relates to, like, literally a hollow space, um, figuratively or literally, for the characters. Like they're missing all kinds of. There's all these like kind of spaces in themselves. They're just empty. They're missing, and so I thought that the play between both the plot device and the emotional story that's being told, like the idea of hollow spaces, work there.
No, I think I can definitely understand that on multiple levels. And yes, I had a title hunt before I went on submission with my agent. We went back and forth a few times. The title we eventually settled on, and that was the title that stuck through for a while. But when the title changed from the querying process to the actual submission and publication process, and it took a while to find something that felt good. Um, as far as like the meaning for your particular title, I can see it just in the blurb and what we've discussed so far, how those both figurative and literal manifestations would come up. Um, this is probably something you're going to struggle to answer, but what advice would you give to people who are struggling to find a good title with their agent, with their editor, and how to find peace with whatever their answer eventually ends up as?
Yeah, well, I will say, just to add for context in answering this question, my title changed slightly between querying, or not querying because I didn't query this particular novel, but when we went out on submission with it. And I think if you look at the publisher's weekly sale announcement, it has the original title, which was, oh no, we changed it right before that. It doesn't matter. The point being is there was one extra word in there that was dropped, which was fine. I think fine by me. It made it much stronger. Um, I I looked at it almost like a very, you want it to mean something. You want it to feel right. Like, it's a hard thing to say what that means, right? Um, I started, the easy way to start for me was, and some people have mixed feelings about this, whether you use words from the book in the title gets repeated in the book, right? And so for me, it was, I think for this one, I was trying to avoid that one, just as an extra challenge to myself. But I did look at it. I mean, I went through some of my favorite phrases or some of the things I thought were really just a couple words that really were good to me, or felt good or could be titles. And I went through those and thought about those for a while. And then I thought about the themes of the novel. And here's another, maybe thing I shouldn't tell, but like the characters' names changed. So the last name of the characters changed. So originally their name was similar, but slightly different. And we discussed changing it because it was a little too on the nose for the themes of the novel. So I changed it out, which was fine. Because actually, when I did the find and replace, what was hilarious is I think the last name only appears in the novel like 7 times in the entire book, maybe less. It was less than 10 for sure.
Makes it
And
easier.
it was, yeah, totally, totally. But so I played with the characters' last names originally, which was something I had done when they had a different last name. But I really came down to, there's a passage in the beginning of the book where it's literally one of the first 2 pages where he just talks about the concept of a hollow. And that concept then comes back like 5 times in the book, like in terms of just both in a literal sense and a figurative sense. Like, but even in the literal sense, there's all kinds of ideas of these like kind of like empty spaces and or literally like a hollow in a tree. Not that's not the plot device, but like, you know, and so that was a word I really wanted to incorporate, I think. And so anyway, that's the way it came about.
No, it's a little bit serendipitous when you're going through and you're finding stuff like that and you're realizing how you can pull it out, and it almost makes it feel that's right. That's the answer right there.
Yeah, and I think with Little Surrenders, which was my Audible short story, again, that title was not immediate to me because I kind of wrote it and then titled it again. Whereas the first novel I wrote, I had the title. That was how I wrote the book. I was like, this is the title, and here's the story. Like that's how it occurred to me. Um, so, but again, with Little Surrenders, it was a similar process. I looked through, I found little thing, and I was like, that was one where actually I think there is the words used, the words Little Surrenders actually appear in the story in passing, and I took that.
Before we let you go today, I just wanted to ask if there's anything that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet that you did want to share about your book or your experience or anything else about this process.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for having me on. I know we're early in what is a new project for you with the channel, and I'm just really glad you had me on. I thank you for the invitation and the lovely conversation.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this week's episode of Lindsey, Byrd and Writing is Hard. Victor Suthammanant's book, Hollow Spaces, is out on the 5th of August. Check out the description for more details on how to buy. If you enjoyed this content, please do like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to make you more. And as always, stay happy and healthy. Bye for now.